pray. So we've been working through a number of different ideas about Ephesians chapter 4 and the idea that Christ has unified the church in one body, and that we are a body that receives life and grace and gifts from Jesus, and from the victory that Jesus won over death and over sin, and the way that Jesus has not only formed us into a body but given people as gifts who are able to organise and lead within the church. But now what I want to focus on is the idea of what it means for us personally. And I think that, I guess there's a lot done on church leadership styles. There's a lot done on church management, and there are some churches that are very well organised. But being part of a body, I want to say, at the most important level is a spiritual sensitivity. It's a spiritual ability that we have to receive grace from Jesus, who is our head, and to contribute to the body as an act of service. And that it is deeply fulfilling, but also really spiritually invigorating and enlightening when we're able to function as a part of that body. As you read through Ephesians 4, as I've been reading out a few different parts of Ephesians 4 during this series, you see that there are three levels. There's a cosmic level in which Christ won the victory, and there is also a community level in which gifts were given to people for the purpose of bringing the church to maturity. But there's also a very personal level to Ephesians 4 that I think is probably the aspect of this chapter of Scripture that often just gets glossed over very quickly. That there's something about living in unity, living in peace, living with patience with one another, and living in humility that we forget about. We put our structures in place in church, and we think the structures are going to carry us. But if we're not kind to one another, then there's no way that any organisational structure is going to be able to work. The grace of Christ is communicated through the head of the body, which is Christ, to the parts of the body. And those parts are unified by Christ. And as we work together, we love one another, and we have a sense of connection to Jesus, who is our head. And that is a deeply spiritual thing, I want to say today. It says in Ephesians 4:16 that from him, it's talking about Jesus here, from Christ, the whole body, joined and held together by every supporting ligament, I guess that's us, the supporting ligaments, grows and builds itself up in love as each part does its work. And that's interesting, is it? That it's while we're doing our work that we're built up in love. That it's actually while we're doing the things that sometimes are so routine, sometimes are so much hard work. Sometimes we say, oh, this is eating into so much of my spare time, and so much of Christianity, especially the way that society works today, it just happens in your spare time. That work that we do is part of the way that we receive grace from Christ, and it's part of the way that we're built up in love for one another. And so we often think that we feel very, I feel spiritual when I'm going on a walk. I feel spiritual when I'm reading. When I'm doing work, sometimes I don't feel spiritual in that moment. But it's in that moment that Christ's grace is working in me, and Christ's presence is there. And when I'm doing things that are useful, and when I'm doing something and realizing that Christ is working through me, then Christ is right there. And it's a time of spiritual growth. And it's a time as well when we discern, we come to know ourselves, and we become better people. We become sanctified by being able to interact with other people and learn skills like patience and learn skills like humility that Ephesians 4 talks about. We think of, and I've mentioned this before, we think of the head in our culture as being a person who makes orders, who makes directives, who makes decisions, the boss of your corporation. The boss is the person who pays you and tells you what to do. But this idea of a head, let me give you another metaphor. Think about the head of a river. Think about the place where the ocean rushes into the river. That place is the head because it's the place that unites us. And I use the different metaphor of a wiki, but maybe it's more appropriate in terms of imagination and metaphor in Ephesians 4 to think about something natural. The head of a river is a place where things flow into that river, where the water comes from. And Christ is the head of the church. Christ is the one who is pouring himself out for us, who gave himself for us in death, and by being raised again, united us into a single body. It's not like the head of a corporation. It's much more like the head of a body. It's more like the head of a river. So when we are doing things that are like work, it's those moments where we're really close to Christ, even though we might not feel that kind of spirituality that our culture often thinks about as being a sense of being transcendent, of being drawn away from the real world. No, it's in the real world. It's there in the day-to-day work that happens that Christ is really present. So I want to come back to the opening of Ephesians chapter 4. And this is a bit like a conclusion for all of it, but I think that it's just so apt, and this verse comes to life so much more profoundly once you've read the rest of the part of the chapter that we're looking at. Ephesians 4, 2-3 says, "Be completely humble and gentle. Be patient, bearing with one another in love, and make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace." And that phrase, I think, it captures everything that I'm trying to say today. Keep the unity of the Spirit, that unity that has been won for us, that unity that Christ created in the church, keep it through the bond of peace, the being joined together, the connection of peace that we have with one another. How do we keep that? How do we be supporting ligaments in this body? We do it by being completely humble, and we do it by being gentle to one another. And that is the sort of stuff that you don't need when you're on a secluded mountain, when you're on a retreat, when you're talking to your counselor or your spiritual director, when you're waking up in the morning and reading a spiritual book. Those things aren't tested then. But when we're working with one another, we have to remember to be humble, and we have to remember to be patient. Otherwise, we don't function as a body. And it's through that interaction that we have when we're working that Christ is able to change us, to really make us into the kind of people that Jesus wants us to be. You know, this unity, this bond of peace, it's a lot more than liking people. Every community has all these different complex relationships in it, but communities find a way to work, and they learn how to do that in the practicalities of day-to-day living and in the difficult things that we have to do in order to keep a community together. You know, sometimes we think that we are amazing, and we want to step out and do something that we just think is marvelous, and we're so inspired by our own gifts. Paul says, be completely humble. You know, if you have that attitude that it's all about you, you're not going to function as part of a community. And the other thing is, we're so aware of our own greatness. We're so aware of our own talents and our skills and our cleverness. We often see the faults in other people so quickly. You know, you work with someone and you're like, this person, they haven't done this, they haven't done that. They're so like this, they speak to me like this, they're unreliable, all these different things. We're so aware of those things in other people, not in ourselves. Paul says, keep the unity of the Spirit by the bond of peace, by being patient with one another, by actually recognizing the goodness in other people, even when they suck, even when they're not as great as we like to think that we are. One thing that I have found in my life is that when I'm working with a community, when I'm living out my calling in life, I'm corrected and I'm given opportunities to change. I remember when I first started training for ministry, I was working in a church that was very different to what I was used to. And I was very standoffish. I was worried about the theology. I was worried about the worship. I was worried that everything wasn't the way that I was used to it being. And halfway through my training for ministry, my supervisor pulled me aside and said, Carl, whenever you come to church, you're aloof. And I was so hurt by that statement that I was coming across as being aloof. And then I went home and I thought about it and I prayed about it and I realized something about myself and it changed. Now, you can read 100 different devotional books. You're never going to learn a lesson that is meaningful unless you get out there and you learn it in real life. You learn about it by making mistakes, learning to be humble about yourself, learning to be picked up by other people and be patient with them and see the good that is in them. I thank God now for that that event that happened in my life, even though it was painful at the time. And coming to Crave, starting this community here, I've learnt to work with a lot of different people and realise that so many different people in my life, they add so much to me. I can see more in other people now than I was able to before I ever started to build this church. I have a more realistic concept of myself. I look in the mirror and I'm like, do you know what? There are some things that are just a gift from God. There are some things that I love about myself. There are some things that are a gift God has given to someone else, God has not given to me. And that knowledge of myself, that has come out of the work of being part of a community. Actually, maintaining that unity through the bond of peace has been the thing in my life that has brought me more spiritual growth than anything else. And I just want to encourage you, if you can find a place to express your giftedness, you're being a gift to other people, not you're having a gift, but emptying yourself, offering yourself as service. There's no greater reward. There's no better way to build your relationship with Christ than there is by functioning as one of those supporting ligaments in the body. So I just want to give thanks to God for what God has done in Jesus, building a community called the Church on Earth and enabling us to function together. I want to thank God for the way that each of us is brought to maturity by being a part of that process, and we can learn to have patience and humility with one another through it. Amen.